Let's get into it. When we talk about Myanmar, we talk about challenges, we talk about problems, we talk about things that maybe didn't work out quite the way we thought they would work out. So let's maybe start at the other end for a second, and let's talk about the good developments. Ambassador Seger, you arrived in Myanmar shortly before the 2016 elections that brought Aung San Suu Kyi's party to power. How do you assess the situation today? In what ways has the country actually improved?
Well, first, let me say hello to everybody, or as we say in Burmese, alone mingalaba. I indeed arrived in October 2015, and the elections actually took place in November 2015, not in February 2016. It was a landslide victory for the NLD, for the National League for Democracy. And it ended a 60-year rule of a military authoritarian regime. And I still remember very well when I arrived in October, it was not clear at all whether these elections would really go through as planned, whether the military would accept the result of these elections. And the military did. But I think the fact that we had, for the first time in 60 years, free and open and fair elections in itself is quite an achievement. Now, the government is in function in office since about 2 years, and there we come back to spring of 2016, because there was a long intermediate time between the elections and the taking of power of the government of the NLD. And I think within 2 years' time, and given the fact where this country is coming from, it's coming out of 60 years of isolation, of 60 years of military rule, of 60 years of stagnation. Quite a lot has been achieved, and we'll come to the elements later on. I don't think that in 2 years you can change dramatically a country which has been isolated and repressed so much. But what I feel myself, as a diplomat and as someone who's living in Myanmar since close to 3 years, that the space has opened. People are expressing themselves in a much freer, more open way as before. This has pros, this has cons, and we come to that, maybe also the relation of Facebook. The economy has certainly improved, maybe not as much as we would hope for. We have a process which is leading towards peace. This process is going very slow, and some people would argue it has stalled, but we're going towards peace, and the government has a clear determination that they want to make peace. So I think, all things considered, within these 2 years, quite important progresses have been made. I think what we all were hoping for, obviously from the West and as international community, was much more. But again, I think we have to understand where this country is coming from, and we also have to do quite a lot of expectation management. So that would be my entering bid.
Excellent. So it sounds like you're cautiously optimistic. Karin Wenger, you visited the country a few months ago last time?
Yeah, I was in January, I was last time there. And I'm not a diplomat, I'm a journalist, so I can afford to be not so diplomatic as Ambassador Seger. I was there during election time in November 2015, and what I realized was this great spirit of hope. People were hopeful. They really hoped there will be big change. They hope there will be economic change, there will be freedom of speech change. There's a tremendous feeling of hope I experienced then. Now, I've been back several times since then, and I have seen this feeling and this sentiment of hope constantly eroding, actually. And Paul, you're optimistic about the peace process. I would be very cautious about this peace process, and we will talk about that later on, because especially in the conflict areas, in the ethnic minority areas, people at that time, also in Rakhine, because I went to Rakhine and to the Rohingyas at that time in 2015, and they were saying, let's see, Aung San Suu Kyi is our best chance. Now, when I went back 2 years later, they said, no, this chance is actually gone. So I'm a bit more cautious and probably a little bit less optimistic than Ambassador Seger. hope still. Oh yeah, you don't need that.
If I just may to comment on Karin's remarks, I think you're certainly right in certain ways, but what I would maybe like to get across is this element of expectations on hope. I think that's an important point. I always say to my friends, when this government was elected by Aung San Suu Kyi with 80% of the votes, expectations on a scale of 1 to 10 were at 12. Experience of this government on a scale of 1 to 10 were at 0. So how do you manage such a difference between high expectations and no experience? Imagine any party in Switzerland having not been able to govern anything. Not a town, not a canton, not a village. And they are now obliged to take over a country which is in ruins, which has been ruined by a government for 60 years. How would we fare in such a situation? So therefore, I would say within 2 years, let's be very rational, let's be very sober what we can expect within 2 years. And I think still what has been done with all limitations and with all shortcomings and all failures, it has been, from my point of view, quite impressive, things considered.
Can I add one thing here?
Please.
Just one.
I think this conversation doesn't really need me.
One thing I would like to add is economic opening didn't start in 2015 or 2016. Economic opening started in 2011. So even before the democratic takeover, there was already an opening. So we can't credit everything to Aung San Suu Kyi and her NLD. And yeah, I would like to say that. And one more thing. There was one of the big hopes was that the army would have less power. And what we see now is the army still has tremendous power. And it's actually disguised now. It's disguised in a democratic regime. And I think this is a really, really big danger.
But let's actually focus on this point and talk a little bit more about this, if you will. I think everybody knows that the political situation right now is such that there's a civilian government which is elected, and then there's the army, and somehow they share power. How does that work? Who actually has how much power, and how is it yielded?
I mean, what we have to say is that the army still has 25% in the parliament. That's guaranteed seats in the parliament. They have 3 really important ministries. They have the power over the borders and the ethnic areas and the conflict areas. So they decide in the end what's happening in all these different civil wars we have in the country. So that's, and they have still considered economic power with their own companies as well. So there is this power still, but we have Aung San Suu Kyi in power who is not criticizing anymore. And I think this is the biggest difference anymore with her being in power.
Ambassador, in your introduction, you seemed cautiously optimistic, and you said a lot of things have not yet happened, but you seem to suggest that maybe things are broadly moving in the right direction. Do you see in this political process the army actually giving power away, or are we not there yet?
On the long run, yes. I had a quite interesting discussion recently, about 3 weeks ago, with the Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, who is the top commander-in-chief. And I was actually fairly surprised by the fact that he is quite respectful of Aung San Suu Kyi and the government she has been elected for. What the army sees itself is the guarantor of stability and unity. I think with all the misgivings, I personally also could voice against what's going on in the country and the role of the army. I think we have to recognize that without the willingness of the army to let go and let these elections of 2015 happening, also with the controls and the caveats you have mentioned, Karin, without the army letting go, this government would not be in power today. Let's face that.
Perhaps it would be better.
No, I don't think so. I really don't think so. And I think nobody in Myanmar, or very few people in Myanmar, would share that view. If you talk to people in Myanmar, nobody wants the army back. And everybody is aware of the fact that this government is in a very difficult position to find a coexistence with the army, because the army said, we agree to accept a political transition which eventually will lead to the fact that we will go back to the barracks like it hasn't happened in Indonesia. But my guess is this will take another 10, maybe 20 years. And we'll come to the peace process. The peace process, from my point of view, is the cornerstone to the possibility of the army going back into barracks and abandoning political power. That is why Aung San Suu Kyi is insisting so much on the peace process. For her, this is an avenue for changing the constitution of 2008. And as Karin rightly said, this constitution gives the army considerable influence. The 25% of the seats, which is the blocking majority to change the constitution, is with the army. As Karin said rightly, 3 key ministries are with the army, and so on and so forth. She wants to change that, and the army knows that this will change. But they want to have what they call a disciplined, controlled democracy, and they're not ready to give power yet. Eventually, I guess they will.
Maybe let's stay with the role of Aung San Suu Kyi. You hinted before at, I'm not sure if I'm summarizing this correctly, but you said basically the only difference is that now she's in government, she can't criticize the army quite effectively anymore as she did before. So it seems to me that her role kind of went from, in Western perception, being the victim to being the hero to now almost being the villain. What is her role? Like, what do you think she's still trying to accomplish? She's, not the youngest person anymore, so she will eventually have to step off the stage. What does she still want to accomplish before that happens?
I think her major role is being a politician. And I think this has really been misunderstood so long, right? I mean, people thought she's the Mother Teresa of Burma. She never said that. She said, I'm not the Mother Teresa. I'm not Mahatma Gandhi. I'm not even Margaret Thatcher. I am a politician, right? And I am just going to be a politician. And then what we also, I think, forgot in all these years where she was made an icon of democracy, also winning the Nobel Peace Prize and so on, is she is a Burman. I mean, she belongs to the majority ethnic community of Burma, and she's the daughter of Aung San, the general who was really crucial in founding this nation. And I think this has been forgotten many times.
So there are elections coming up, I think, in 2020 next time.
Right.
And again, as I mentioned before, it's likely that during that process, somehow her succession will have to be determined. Are we anywhere near that process having been started? Do we know what's happening if Aung San Suu Kyi isn't there anymore?
I mean, Paul is much more involved in that than I am. For us, it's really, really difficult to get information because she doesn't talk to the media. And I've been speaking to her lawyer. He had a kind of he was very super old and wasn't very fit anymore. And what I heard as well is that she's surrounded by a bunch of people who keep tight control and doesn't really let much young people come up. And there were also people who were with her in the struggle of '88 who were sidelined. So I don't know, you know more about that, Paul, no?
A little. Yes, I agree. The NLD has a generational problem, and it's overage. That's for sure. However, with the recent changing of the president, there is now, from my point of view, a possible figure who could succeed her if she doesn't want to run anymore in 2020, which is not sure. She's born in 1945. She's 73 years old. She has aged quite a lot since I have seen her the first time, and now it's really two different persons. I think what we should understand is Burmese mentality is very important to know about Burmese mentality. It's a society which is very much top heavy. Decisions anywhere are always delegated up to the top, and basically everything rests on her shoulders and on her shoulders alone. And that makes it extremely difficult for her also to change. And she always knows that the army is breathing down her neck. And obviously that, in addition to this cultural habit of controlling everything, makes this control paranoia, if I may even call it that way, makes it so evident. I still believe that NLD in 2020 will win the elections. Not with the same landslide victory as they have done in 2015, but there's basically very little alternative to the NLD if you look at the geopolitical and also geographical and demographical distribution. As Karin said, 60% of the population is Bamar, and these 60% will vote NLD massively. The rest may not, but they really don't count so much in numbers. So the NLD will win. Who will be the next president is not sure. It could be the actual one. It could be, for instance, the Yangon chief minister, U Pyo Min Tain, who is like 50-something. He's a young guy like me. For new Burmese standards. So there is, behind the scenes, some generational change going on. Whether it will lead to a change in 2020, it's pure speculation. But there are things going on which are not so open to the eye right now.
But Paul, can I ask a question to Paul?
Yeah, sure.
Well, isn't it a little bit easy as well to say this is like Burmese culture and there's always like this dictator on the top or the one who dominates? Because I met people who really said we wanted to be part of that, right? And I met people who said she's just an absolute control freak. I mean, you know, I just saw her passing by, but you know her better.
Yes, she's a control freak. I agree. She's a control freak. You know, I don't want to defend her. I just explain what I perceive as one trait of Burmese culture. And it does not obviously justify or explain everything. And the fact that she is a control freak is really true. But let's face it. She has survived 15 years of house arrest and isolation. You know, that makes her an extremely strong-willed person, and therefore she feels responsible for the sake of this country. She feels responsible that this third attempt of transiting towards peace and democracy will succeed. Two have failed. So therefore, she really wants to control. I agree with you. Whether this is right or wrong, it's not me to judge. But it's a fact that she's a control freak. This is true.
And it's all about the political legacy, right? What you asked before, much earlier when I didn't really answer, what's her goal, right? It's about her political legacy. I mean, she sacrificed her life for that. She didn't see her husband die. She hardly saw her children. She was 15 years in house arrest. I mean, it's really her political legacy which is at stake. And I think she will do anything and everything to get a proper legacy. And that might mean as well to be in bed with the army.
But you seem to suggest that she doesn't have that yet, so there's still work to do on that political legacy.
And she admits that.
Yeah.
She admits that.
I mean, especially before she took power, she said one of her major goals is the peace process, right? And in my view, the peace process is nowhere, right? It's actually going back. So that's one major thing she hasn't achieved yet.
Let's look before we get to the peace process, which we'll talk about in detail as well. But let's quickly look at this other transformation, which, as you've pointed out, actually started much earlier, so much long before the 2015 elections, which is the economic kind of like transformation. Now, the economy has developed; it's doing better, I think, than it used to. But Myanmar still has the lowest GDP per capita of all ASEAN countries. There's a low life expectancy. So it seems at the very least that we could say that this development may not happen quite as quickly as, again, everybody expected. Maybe because of overblown expectations, but there may be other reasons. So why are we not seeing the kind of economic miracle that everybody kind of assumed would just happen after those elections, or
I guess
even earlier?
It's also because people had too high expectations which couldn't be fulfilled. That's one thing. And then, as Paul said before, this was a government who had absolutely no experience, no economic experience as well, no policy experience. So, for example, one thing they did in Yangon was, one of the first things was to put a stop on high-rise buildings in Yangon. And that caused tremendous kind of people are not happy about that, and it crashed the market for a moment. So that's what I heard from the whole builder industry. Then the Rohingya crisis. That was one reason why there was a sharp decline, for example, in Western tourists coming into the country. I mean, the Asians still come, but the Westerns, they do not come anymore. Would you know more about that?
How do international companies feel about investing in Myanmar, setting up factories in Myanmar? Is that still something that's being explored?
It is, but it is true that obviously now since the Rohingya crisis, the many international field enterprises have become cold field. You know, it's for them becoming a reputational hazard. This is really true, and this is one of the major crises which is bearing heavily on Myanmar, on investment, on tourism, on the international image. We'll come to that in a moment. But I agree, the government has had difficulties in getting the economical agenda of the starting blocks. They adopted a 12-point economic plan, but the industry complained that it has not been followed up. It is true that they stopped quite a lot of investments, but they were afraid that all these permits have been given through corruption, which may or may be not true, but corruption is a big problem in this country. And the other thing is, again, and we need to know that, the government is elected, but the whole administration, which is there to implement all these policies, comes from the old guard. It's all military people. So imagine again the Swiss Federal Council being elected, but all the administration is not loyal to the government. How can a government function like that? You know, it's very difficult. Now they have started to implement a number of important changes, like a new investment law, new companies law. So I'm still thinking that although the next 2 to 3 years will be economically very difficult for the country, I'm afraid, that if you look at the long run, the next 10 to 20 years, this country has an enormous potential. It's one of the richest countries in natural resource in the region. And let's not forget, 50 years back, which is not so long time ago, this country had the double net income of Thailand. Double net income of Thailand. One chat, which is the national currency, for which you have to pay now 1,300 chat for $1, was $1. And the dollar in 1962, some people still remember, was much more than it is right now. So this country once was fairly rich. And for me, nothing precludes, if they get things right, to get back once where they were. But it will take time.
Can I add something? Something a little bit different, but what I always find very interesting is the story of the SIM cards.
Oh yeah.
So the country was closed for such a long time, but then 2011 the economic opening happened, and a bit later the telecom industry opened up, and there are foreign telecom industries coming into the country. So before, a SIM card used to cost $2,000. So you can imagine that hardly anyone could afford a SIM card. Today, a SIM card costs like 1.5 francs, or even less, right? So people have like multiple SIM cards, and the entire life, the village gossip, moved to Facebook. So that's a tremendous change in the social fabric as well, and it also shows like this economic opening and what it means for the society and for the people.
Let's maybe stay with this topic for a little bit. This like very rapid digitalization, as we've seen a lot of other Asian countries as well. There was a leapfrogging effect, so people moved straight to mobile.
Exactly.
We talked about this before. I think SIM card penetration is at 113% at the country. So more
because people have different SIM cards.
People have several SIM cards. Is there any discernible economic benefit of that? So do we actually see a positive effect on people's lives in general as an effect of this digitalization? We'll get to sort of the dark sides as well afterwards, but first, is there something that this actually benefits people? There is.
I mean, I remember I went to see fishermen, and they had no electricity, they had no toilet, they lived in a little shack, and they had a mobile phone, a smartphone. As you said, they jumped generations of mobile phones. They had a smartphone. And they told me, yes, today it's great with the SIM card and with the mobile phone and the internet. I can basically put the price at my fish, or I can check the prices online, and then I can sell accordingly. Something which didn't happen before.
Yeah. Nothing to add to that. It's true. It's really a big boost, and it has created obviously a new economy, also a service provider economy, which hasn't existed before, and that generated also income.
And maybe to stick with, and I think this is important also to realize, is that in many extents in Myanmar, Facebook is the internet. So much more than what it is here, where it is a sort of comparatively sort of narrow segment of usages that Facebook is being used for. There it is really everything. A colleague of yours that I spoke to on Friday said that if she wants to schedule an interview with somebody in Myanmar that happens over Facebook, everything kind of like happens over Facebook. It's like WeChat in China. So there have been numerous reports from Myanmar and other countries where Facebook has such a dominance that also hinted at this being a problem in terms of distribution of information and fake news. Is that actually something that has also influenced kind of the public discourse in Myanmar in a bad way?
It has. I mean, first, perhaps a good point, because I'm actually more the advocate of the bad things here. So a good point. During the election in 2015, I think the internet and Facebook played a major role that the NLD won. Perhaps you can add to that later. The bad points are, this is a country which was closed for decades, right? I mean, critical thinking, it's not there. Now, everything goes out on Facebook. So there have been numerous people who have been arrested because of Facebook postings they made. Another thing which happened is that there's a lot of hate speech which is put on Facebook, and it's taken literally. So, for example, I remember I met this quite radical Buddhist monk, Ashin Viratu, 2 years ago. And he had put on Facebook that a Muslim man had raped a Buddhist woman in his village. Just after that, turmoil broke out. There were clashes, people got killed, and then it turned out that it was not true. So people really take what's on Facebook for face value, and that's super dangerous.
And is there anything that the government or international actors are trying to address it? I think here in the West we have kind of a backlash, and Mark Zuckerberg has to testify before the US Congress and for the European Parliament. Is there anything that can and is being done to address that issue and also hold those players like Facebook accountable?
Well, I agree with Karin. I think Facebook has really two sides. It has a very positive side, but it has also a very negative side. But maybe just to explain also you can obviously for each case, you mentioned make a counter case. There was recently also an example which was really interesting in Mandalay, where you have, I would say, a strong Muslim community and a Buddhist community, where indeed some extremist Buddhists try to incite communal and interreligious violence against Muslims. And there Facebook was used positively to mobilize people against that. You know, that they stand up and say, no, we don't participate in these manifestations. You know, we mobilize people to calm people down. So it's working in negative ways, but also positively. Now, the thing is, and we come back to Burmese culture, to criticize someone openly, publicly, in Myanmar is a no-no. It's about face saving. You don't do that. You know, if I tell my cook he has cooked badly, I don't tell him that. I say, listen, it was really great, but next time you could maybe do it differently. You know? Although I couldn't even eat what he was cooking. So this also transcends into use of public criticism. And the government, unfortunately, did not change one of the laws which actually have as an effect that if you criticize someone in public through Facebook and other electronic media, you can get to jail because such person may accuse you of slander. And that obviously is a very undemocratic way of dealing with criticism. And we from the international community, we have time again called upon the government to change that law. It hasn't been changed, and I could explain the reason why it hasn't been changed, but the fact that dealing with criticism and controversial opinions has not been practiced, as Karin has said. You know, this government and also this society was never used to discourse, to dialogue, to criticism. And it's now opening up through Facebook with all its uncontrolled effects. And to get that someone under control by not kind of muzzling public opinion and public discourse is a very difficult task to achieve from my point of view. I don't have the answer to that, but something needs to be done, but what exactly, it's difficult to say.
And at the same time, hate speeches are very frequently delivered on Facebook, right? In spite of the cultural difference. And
this is true. But let's also say that the government has forbidden Mabata, which is the organization of Uviratu. So they have taken steps, to curtail these extremists. But basically, it's you cannot control Facebook. Basically, you all know that. It's like a river. If it finds an obstacle, it goes around and gets another. So the government is trying to work against hate speech and fundamentalists, but obviously its success is, let's face it, quite limited.
And I think this, in combination with a non-critical free press, that's the danger as well, right? I mean, we have seen that in the Rohingya crisis. When I went to Sitwe in Rakhine and I spoke to Buddhist communities after the Rohingya crisis started, they basically took out their mobile phones and they showed me their Facebook postings and some articles. They were all absolutely anti-Rohingyas. So there's no kind of critical press as well where people could get like a second opinion.
I disagree. No? Karin, I disagree on that. I fundamentally disagree on that.
Go ahead.
There is publications like Frontier Myanmar, there is Mizima, there is Irrawaddy. These are
English publications, right?
Yeah, but they publish also in Burmese. And my people who understand and read Burmese, I'm afraid I don't do it too well, they really tell me you have critical articles also in Burmese about that. That did not exist before 2015. I think this is still, with all the shortcomings and all the misgivings you can have about freedom of press and the freedom of opinion in this country, it's for me one of the major achievements. You can read articles who would not have been reading 3 years or 2 years ago.
Let's maybe, I do want to also, in the interest of time, move on to what is probably the most complex of all issues that we want to talk about today, and we haven't really addressed it, but you both have mentioned it, which is the peace process. And I think you both have said this is this one crucial piece that if the peace process isn't actually being developed, if it isn't being resolved, then there's very little hope for any political process to actually be successful. And we kind of just had this term of peace process out there, and that probably understates the complexity of the issue. So maybe let's just start with this. When we say peace process in Myanmar, what do we mean? What is that process? What does it consist of? Who are the actors? Shortly, there are a lot of them, but how does this peace process look like right now? Where are we in the process?
Let's get the diplomatic answer first.
Well, we have to go back in time. 1948, when the country became independent from the British colonialists, Aung San, who is the father of Aung San Suu Kyi and the father of Myanmar's independence, actually asked the ethnic groups, the major ethnic groups, the Shan, the Kachin, the Chin, and others, for support.
How many ethnic groups are there?
Well, there are 135 recognized ethnic groups, but I would say the major ones are 6 or 7. So he asked the major ethnic groups for support against the British colonialists, which they gave. In return, he promised them self-determination and a large part of autonomy. Now, he was killed in 1947, before autonomy happened, and his promise was never fulfilled. And obviously, that was the start of the longest running internal conflict we know in history between these ethnic groups and the central power of the Myanmar, which are 60% of the population. Now, these ethnic groups, the Shan, the Kachin, all these, they don't want to take over the country like you have in other countries like Colombia, where the FARC wants to rule over the whole country. They just want to be themselves. They want to have their own language, their own control of their resources, their own form of government. It's like we in Switzerland, we want federalism where we would like to be from Zurich, from Basel, from Bern, from Lausanne. That's basically what they want. The government and all the military governments never gave that to them. And that is the reason why they still have this conflict, where this apartheid still fighting going on. Now, since 2015, there is a so-called national ceasefire, which is not really national, but it's called that way, where out of the 20 armed groups, now 10, half of them has signed to it. So if you look at the Myanmar map, the south of the country, which is close to Thailand, is basically peaceful, apart of certain clashes. The north of the country, which is close to China mostly, but also Laos and the northern part of Myanmar, there's still violence, conflict, killings, and shooting going on, especially now in Kachin, where there is major military operations taking place. Now, let's be clear about one thing. Myanmar is not Somalia. Myanmar is not Afghanistan. If you go to Yangon, to Bagan, to India Lake, to Mandalay, you won't feel anything of this conflict. The conflict is taking place in some marginal areas. That doesn't make it any better for the people who live there. It's a tragedy which is happening there. But this is a country where 90% of the population is not really suffering from the conflict. Obviously, the other 10% are suffering very much. So that is going on since 70 years. And again, it will take time to overcome the conflict, but we are now, from my point of view, at least as hopeful as can be that eventually this country will come to terms for peace. Because when I speak to a lot of people, and we are at Switzerland, I come to that point in that moment, we are very active in the peace process. With all the differences and all the difficulties everybody's facing, everybody wants to end this war. The army wants to end this war, ethnic armed groups want to end this war, and most of all, the government wants to end this war. They don't have to find a way yet to do that. But for me, it's important that the political will to end this war is there.
And now for some undiplomatic comments to that.
Okay, I will go to undiplomatic comments. So that was really a hopeful picture. It was a great summary as well of the history. Now, as Paul said, it's called a nationwide ceasefire with 10 of the 20 group. It's nothing like nationwide. And what he calls hopeful, I would call divide and conquer. Because what I've seen when I traveled to the northern Shan state where the clashes are still going on, I went to see a rebel group called TNLA. It's a small group.
You saw the worst guys.
I didn't tell you. I saw more than them. Anyway, so they were fighting the government and the army for quite a long time. Now, after the ceasefire in 2015, the army backed out, but they sent another ethnic rebel group, a Shan rebel group, up north to fight the TNLA. So basically the army is out, they have clean hands, and they say, we are not doing anything, but the Shans are fighting now the TNLA. Right, that's one thing. The other thing, I just went to Kachin a few months ago. Kachin is the gold and ruby and jade chamber of Burma. And who owns the mines? The army, in the major parts.
And the KIA.
No, yeah, but that's a minority. I mean, they have a few, but the major part of jade owned or jade mines are owned by the army. There was a report actually by Global Witness, an international NGO, and they said in 2014 the army earned $31 billion by selling jade. That was about roughly half the GDP of the country. Obviously, it doesn't show up in the country. So here it goes about, it's about a lot of money. It's about resources. It's about a lot of money. Now, 2 weeks ago, I went to the Thai-Burmese border to meet the Shan rebels.
Second worst guy?
The RCSS. Who are actually fighting the TNLA. So they're in a ceasefire. They're not fighting at the moment except the TNLA. And he was like, yeah, it's kind of quiet, but we have a massive problem which is drugs, methamphetamine, which is the biggest, most valuable export product in the region. They're mainly built or produced. You need to produce them, and it's really easy to produce them. It's hidden in little shelters. You don't see them. It's not like opium. By militias. Militias. Some of them were rebels before. They changed the side. They're now doing the dirty jobs of the army. They are actually producing the amphetamine, and they're exporting the amphetamine. Most of it gets exported, but a major chunk also stays within the ethnic minority groups. So this rebel commander, this big moustache, was a bit bored sitting there. He said, now they want actually to destroy us, not anymore by bullets, but by methamphetamine, because we have entire villages which are addicted to methamphetamine. In his army camp, he had about 300-400 drug addicts he put on the addiction. And they were actually jogging by there, and then they were recruited into the army.
No.
Third point. We have seen more army moving up to northern Shan state, in some areas of northern Shan state. The IDPs, the internally displaced people, Shan minority people who have been thrown out of the country, they had to flee ethnic violence 20 years ago, who are now living along the Thai-Burmese border. They cannot go back there because land has been given to the boss, for example. Land has been taken for mines. Land has been taken for hydropower, and so on and so on. So many of these people, they can never go back. And they're also saying there is no chance, because in many areas we have now army camps, we have army checkpoints. So I'm not so hopeful.
Yeah. Let's. I think what this really shows, and I think this is an important point, is that this peace process is really actually several processes. There are a lot of those groups involved. Let's, though, again, in the interest of time, we haven't really spoken, I think, about this main issue that we hear a lot when we talk about Myanmar, which is the Rohingya crisis in Rakhine State. And we did want to sort of paint a broader picture, but I do think we have to talk about that as well. It's obviously a humanitarian catastrophe on unprecedented scale. I don't think we need to discuss that. What strikes me is, from what I've read, from what people have told me, is that here is a conflict where what the army is doing in displacing these people, in burning down the villages, in absolutely horrifying numbers, actually enjoys almost the broadest possible support from within the country. It enjoys the support of the civilian elected government. It enjoys the support of, as far as we can tell, like the average people. Mm-hmm. And again, keep in mind that those are people who have lived under the rule, the military rule of that army, and probably have every reason to mistrust anything the army says. Yet in this case, they seem ready to believe anything that is being put in front of them when it is about the Rohingya. I can't really wrap my head around why that is.
Well, where should I start? Well, first of all, let me just put a few things straight about government support for the persecution of the Rohingya. When Aung San Suu Kyi came into power in May of 2016, one of the first things she did after getting into power was call upon Kofi Annan and his International Commission to present to her a comprehensive plan to find a political solution for the plight of the Rohingya. People are just completely forgetting that. And that in itself has costed her quite a lot of political capital, because it is true that a major part of the population is quite mistrustful and negative about the Muslim minority in Rakhine.
And why is that? Why are they so distrustful?
Well, there again, we could start with one thing. The province of Rakhine as such, which is the western part bordering Bangladesh, is a province which is largely the size of Switzerland, a little bit smaller. About 3 million people live there. About 2/3 were Buddhists, were native Rakhine, and until recently about 1 million were Rohingyas. even the Rakhine themselves, which are Buddhists, are disliked by the rest of the population. It's not only about the Rohingya which are disliked, they are at the very end of the population ladder, but even the Rakhine themselves are disliked by their own brethren, by their own Buddhists in Myanmar. That has historical, cultural, and other reasons. So the province is such, by many people living in Yangon, Mandalay, in the centers, is something which they don't like at all. And that is even more true for the Rohingya, for the Muslims. I think there is what I consider a very strong fear factor here. It's about loss of identity. It's about the fear of Islamization. And all these phenomena we also have to a certain extent also in Europe. You know, this fear factor is also present elsewhere. It's even stronger present in a society, and we come back to what we said initially, which has been shut out of the world for 60 years, where globalization, where the issue of the class of civilizations, where a discourse about how we interact with other communities, with other religions, had not taken place. And this is all of opening up and coming like a tsunami. So this fear factor, from my point of view, plays a very important role to play. So I would not say that this government is condoning what is happening in Myanmar. It's maybe not sufficiently powerful to do anything about it, but it's not condoning it. I'm pretty sure about that. I would even go as far as saying that the general population is condoning it. They just don't care. They have other problems to solve on an everyday basis. So for them, it's a remote part of the country, and they really don't care so much about what's going on there. So I would not go as far as saying that the population and the government is covering and supporting the army. I would not do that.
Would you agree?
Partly, yes. I think one reason as well is it has been the narrative for decades, right? That the Rohingyas are the filthy ones. The army already said it in the 60s, right? They have been brought in by the British colonialists, and they're not belonging to us. They're not one of us. And it's kind of as if they were like a different kind of creature in the entire country. So I was surprised to see in Yangon, I interviewed this one guy, an 88 activist, who spent years in jail because he was fighting for democratic rights in Burma. When I talked about the Rohingyas and I asked him about that, he was like, oh no, they have to go back to Bangladesh. They're not one of us. When I talked to the monk, Viratu again, but also to other monks which are less extreme, they were saying like, they want to steal, these are Muslims, they want to steal our land, they have to go back. Only if someone can guarantee that they will be peaceful here in our country, they can stay. So it has been, I think, a narrative which was told to the people for many, many, many years. And then also, when I went to Kachin, where the conflict is going on, another ethnic minority, and I asked them about the Rohingyas, they said, we are now afraid, because the army basically cleaned out the Rohingyas in a textbook ethnic cleansing, as the UN called it. Now we are afraid they're going to do the same up here in Kachin. So there's a fear, and there's obviously also like a self-preservation kind of factor with the ethnic minorities. And yeah, there's like a divide. They are not one of us.
But it seems that the 88 political activist that you've mentioned who spent so long in jail,
yeah.
It seems curious to me, and I'm just trying to sort of get to the point where we understand the sort of how those two seemingly contradictory statements can exist within like one person's ideology,
yeah.
Whereas you fight for democracy, you fight for inclusion, but then you have a very, very clear view that there are people who don't belong in this country.
I was stunned. I was the same like you. I was stunned. But you know, if you say you don't think actually that the government has this strict policy or doesn't condone it, when I met the lawyer of Aung San Suu Kyi, he said the same. He said they have to go back to Bangladesh. He was the lawyer of Aung San Suu Kyi, so he was really, really clear.
Yeah, but Karin, if this is true, why did the government unconditionally and fully accept publicly the 87 recommendations of the Kofi Annan Commission? Kofi Annan, a world leader who basically said, these people need to stay there, these people need to get citizenship, these people need to move freely. The government said yes to that, you know. So,
but then there is this whole story
with all due respect with the lawyer,
right,
but the government positions is crystal clear. Obviously, they have difficulties in implementing that, and nobody's denying that, and they're struggling, they're making mistakes. It's not going the right way as we want it, but I'm pretty sure, and I give them the benefit of the doubt, that the government really means it. And recently, you know, the government has even gone a step further now. They accept now an international inquiry into the grave accusations of atrocities committed in Rakhine. It has taken them time, but now they come about. You know, obviously, international pressure played an important role in that. But you know, they are not the villains we would maybe like to portray them here. It's not as black and white as we would like to see it. And again, coming back to the Kofi Annan recommendations, these were presented on August 23rd of 2017. The very same day, these recommendations, which were destined to find a political solution, the very same day the ARSA, which is the extremist Rohingya, launched a full-scale attack in Rakhine. So you also have, on the other side, extremists who have no interest in a political solution. Obviously, I don't want to justify and condone in any way the completely irresponsible and horrific attacks which the government, or not the government, but the army has made. This is unpardonable, unexcusable. But let's also understand where this also is coming from. The situation is maybe a little bit more complex than people might believe.
Let's maybe, since we're kind of like slowly ending that part of the conversation, let's end by looking forward. So I think we've seen the Rohingya is just one of many very protracted, complicated conflicts that are happening in the country. Ambassador Seger has pointed out there are international recommendations on the table which the Myanmar government has accepted. So do you see, from where you're standing, any realistic scenario that would eventually resolve this conflict in a, let's say, I'm not sure if we can get peaceful anymore, but in a way that somehow would make it possible for the country to move on, even if it takes a few years? Is there a solution somewhere on the horizon?
I don't see one. I do not see one, because, I mean, Paul, you're a diplomat. You know, they're like treaties and signatures. That's all nice. But in the end, it has to be implemented on the ground, right? And this was fine. We are talking now about 700,000 people, Rohingyas, who have been expulsed. They were fleeing to Bangladesh. But that was not the first time. There were like again and again and again. There were 10,000s of people being expulsed. There were small little repatriation efforts for people to come back. But we had, for example, these big clashes in 2012 around Sittwe. Since then, there are more than 120,000 Rohingyas who are living in a camp, which is like a prison camp around Sittwe. There is no solution for these people. They have no clinics, they have no future, they have no schools. There was the crisis a few years later about the boat people. These were people who came also from these camps because there was no future, and they ended up in slave camps along the Thai border. So I think if we talk about hope and treaties and whatever, I mean, these people, they are not recognized neither in Burma nor in Bangladesh. I mean, as long as this fundamental, crucial, main problem is not solved, I do not see a solution. And what will happen then is that they end up in these camps in Bangladesh for the next generations, basically.
And maybe, Ambassador, when you comment, maybe you can also comment a little bit on what Switzerland is doing and what you are doing on the ground to address those and other issues as well.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with Karin that the solution is not easy to find. There are certainly, at this point of time, maybe third or maybe at best second best solutions which are possible. It will take a lot of time. One of the problems I see is that a lot of these refugees now who are Rohingya in Bangladesh don't want to come back because they're afraid. after what had happened in October 2016, after what happened in August 2017, they're basically afraid to come back.
And so the villages are gone in many cases.
Well, the government is ready to rebuild them, but that's a marginal issue. The problem from my point of view is basically what we need to work on, and that's what we're trying to do also modestly and humbly from the Swiss side, is to bring these two communities together, to overcome the hatred, to overcome the fear, because that since 2012 has been one of the determining factors which then led to these triggering effects in 16 and 17. And it is true, Karin, it's completely true, that this is a minority which has been discriminated for decades. And I agree that these camps in Sittwe, and I haven't been to Cox's Bazar, are really, it's unhuman, really, it is. This needs to change. But I would go as far as saying that if there is any change for the better, it is with this NLD government. It is certainly not with a right-wing nationalist government formed by the USDP or by any other military-backed political party. So if we have hope to have a solution in the middle and the long time, I don't talk about 1 year, I talk about 2 years, it will take maybe much more time. And maybe not all of them will come back. I think we have to accept that inconvenient truth as well. But if we want to work for a solution, we have to work it that way. What we do, for instance, we bring two of these communities together to Switzerland. We show them how we in our country try to live together with different communities, different religions, different ways of living together, to show it can be done. We're also struggling in Switzerland. Let's face it, we also have our problems with Muslims in Switzerland. Let's be honest with ourselves. We are not perfect. But at least we try to expose them that there are ways and means to finding a coexistence together. Not as, you don't need to be friends, you don't need to be embracing each other, but you just basically need to live together. And that's what we're trying to do together with humanitarian assistance and other things as well. So it also works with development. This Rakhine province is one of the poorest, if not the poorest, of Myanmar. If the cake is getting bigger for everybody, also the acceptance, I hope, to accept the other parts also are fed and nourished, is there. Because these people basically want what everybody wants, to work, to have a roof over your head and send your kids to school and to be able to go to a hospital if you're sick. These are basic needs everybody has, whether you're Muslim or Buddhist or Christian or whatever, it doesn't really matter. So we need to work on these elements as well.
I think that's absolutely crucial, and if time allows 2 minutes, can I tell a little story about that? Because when I went in January to Sittwe, I was not allowed anymore in the camps. So for journalists in many major parts, it has become much more difficult actually to report about the Rakhine and the Rohingya crisis. There are also Reuters journalists who are in jail because they did, or they were about to do. I went to a little village outside of the camps where there was a Buddhist community on one side, and inside, actually about 100 meters, there was a Rohingya community. They had been living together peacefully for many years. They were trading with each other, they were visiting each other, they were neighbors, right? There were two little village neighbors next to each other. In 2012, these violences happened between them, clashes happened. They ran, first I went to the Rohingya village. They told me the story that the Buddhists came, they attacked their village, they killed people. Since then, they're not seeing each other anymore. And they have more restrictions being Rohingya. Next day, and they were afraid. Next day, I went to the Buddhist village, just 100 meters away. And I talked to them and they said, yes, on that in 2012, the Rohingyas came, they attacked us and they killed us. It was absolutely identical, the same story. And they were living next to each other. They had two narratives in their head, which were absolute opposite. And I was like, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. So I went to the monk and I went to the imam on the other side. And I asked them, you're religious leaders, what are you doing? It's your job to kind of bring people together to make this life a bit more peaceful here, because everyone was afraid and seriously afraid. They said, no way. The Buddhist monk said, with these people you cannot live together, these are Muslims. The imam said, no way, we cannot live together with them because they attacked us. So I think it's absolutely crucial that people start talking to each other anymore. Again.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you very, very much.